When it comes to media about giant robots punching each other, I believe one thing, and that's the bigger the robot, the more fun it is to watch fight. So when we started getting bigger and bigger Transformers in the original series, I was not complaining one bit. And out of all those giant robots, one of my personal favorites was Omega Supreme. Maybe it was his slow minimal dialect, his overall design, or maybe the fact that he was just so chunky. But I really do love Omega Supreme as a character. So now that some Legend Scale companies are finally making some Omega Supreme figures, I'm super hyped. What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Speakerhead, and today we're going to be taking a look at the first Legend Scale Omega Supreme made by Pangu toys. But before we get into this review, if you enjoy any of this sort of content, make sure to like and subscribe. It really does help me out. I'm personally trying to hit 1,000 subscribers on my channel before 2024, so if you want to help out the channel, make sure to subscribe. Also, quick reminder that 1 like equals 1 pat for my little buddy Doug here. Say hi, Doug. Also, if you enjoy any of the music in this video or just want to support the channel in general, it's all part of my royalty-free music label, Speakerhead Studios. All the music on this label is completely royalty-free, so go ahead and use it for any of your content creating needs. But now that we got all that out of the way, let's get into the review. And to start off, as usual, we're going to talk about accessories. To start off, he comes with an extra face that has an open mouth expression, and it's painted the same exact way as the other face, and these can just be swapped out by popping off the faceplate. Next, he comes with a few different blast effects that can attach to each other. And personally, I think this is really fun because many Legend Scale figures don't come with blast effects, so it's really nice that this comes with one. And then finally, it's going to come with this little repair drum from that one episode. I'm not going to go into crazy detail, but I am going to speedrun my regular points for any other figure. For paint job, he's going to have paint on his face, chest, hands, crotch, and feet. And the paint job on this guy is nice overall. Moving on to articulation, his head can move left and right. His arms can go all the way out and all the way around. He has an elbow bend of 90 degrees. He has a waist swivel. His legs can go all the way forward, all the way back, and all the way to the side. There is a knee bend that can get slightly more than 90 degrees. And then his feet are on ball joints that can pivot around. So I don't really know much about this character, but overall it is a pretty good little figure that comes with this guy. So now that we talked about accessories, let's actually move on to Omega Supreme. And to start off, we're going to talk about the sculpt of this figure. So from a glance, the sculpt of this guy isn't terrible, but there are some fine details that start to get sloppy. Starting with the head sculpt, it is a very nice sculpt. My only complaint is going to be that obvious gap right in the center of his face, and you'll see that that's a problem throughout the rest of this figure. But like I said, for the head and face sculpt, it is really nice. Moving on to the arms, I like the sculpt and some of the fine details that are there. I like the little bit of sculpt work in the arms that adds some character to the figure. And then moving down to the lower arms, I do like the sculpt that's all over the rocket. Something else minor to mention is that I do like the sculpt work in the back of the arms. I like how they added sculpt in the elbows so it wasn't just plain back there. I thought that was a nice touch. Something I want to mention about the lower arms is that the front of the rocket and the claw part can both be detached. Then you're also able to add a battery into the tip of the rocket to make it light up and save voice lines. Now moving on to the torso, once again I do love all the fine details that are on the chest. Something I will mention is that there are no missiles on his chest like other Omega Supreme figures, and that's most likely due to the limitation of this figure's budget. I know some people might be upset by this, but I personally don't mind since I never really mess with them on my Titan class Omega Supreme. But once again, for the torso, I think it does look great. Also quickly moving to the back, I do like the sculpt work for his jetpack. I think that also looks really nice. Moving on to the lower torso and upper legs, once again, I think that it looks alright. I wish that the flaps on his legs were a little longer, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But for the sculpt of the lower torso and upper legs, I think it's nice. For the lower legs and feet, they're pretty boring, but I think they look pretty nice. The only thing I can really say is just like the rest of the figure, I really do like the minor sculpt work that's all around the legs. It just makes the figure a little bit more interesting to look at. The only other thing I want to mention about the legs is that one of my legs doesn't want to tab in properly. I've tried multiple times and no matter what, it does not want to tab in and there's just this big gap in the back. It's kind of annoying, but for the most part, you're going to be seeing the figure from the front, so it doesn't bother me too much. So when it comes to the overall sculpt in this guy, I think it is really good, but you can really tell that this is a newer company making this figure, because this figure has a lot of unintentional gaps just due to the mold of the figure. But the overall sculpt on this guy is pretty solid as long as you don't mind those gaps. But now that we're all done with sculpt, let's move on to the paint job on this guy. Starting with his head, there's some nice reds on the sides of his head. Then there's a nice paint job on his face with the orange, the blue for his eyes, and the nice silver on top. Moving to his upper arms, the only paint that's going to be on there is that little bit of orange on the front. Moving down to his lower arms, there's going to be some nice silver and gunmetal painted details. Moving to his torso now, he's going to have some nice red and orange painted right in the center of his chest. A tiny bit of silver detail on those yellow pieces where those missiles should hide. And then some nice gunmetal on his jetpack. Quickly talking about the lower torso, there's not going to be any sort of paint on there. Moving to the upper legs, there's going to be a tiny bit of silver paint on the front. And then on the back, there's going to be some silver and yellow paint applied. Finally, moving down to his lower legs and feet, he's going to have a tiny bit of silver detail in the front of his legs, some silver details on both sides of each leg, and then finally some yellow paint on the back. So this guy doesn't have a crazy amount of paint on him, but the paint that is there is really nicely applied, and it is some nice looking paint. So now that we're all done with paint, let's move on to the posability. Starting with his head, he has some pretty good posability. For starters, his neck's able to pop up, so he's able to look up and slightly down. And then he's also able to look left and right. Moving on to his shoulders, they can go all the way out to the side and all the way around, no problem. Moving down to the lower arms, each arm can get a 90-degree bend, and both of them have a bicep swivel. And then his claw can rotate if you do need to adjust it at all. Something to mention is that my lower arms like to slide out of place because they don't lock in at all, so that's something to keep in mind. Talking about his torso, he has no ab crunch, but he does have a waist swivel. Moving on to the lower legs, they can go all the way out to the side, all the way forward, and all the way back. So there's a couple things I want to mention about the legs fast. The first thing I want to mention is that the legs don't have any sort of ratchet joints, and my left leg is already starting to get loose. The other thing I wanted to bring up is his hip skirts, which I mentioned before. Something I have noticed because the side skirts are so short is that the leg will sometimes press against the actual side skirt instead of moving it. And as you can see by the pictures, you can kind of see where I actually did that on my figure. So just keep that in mind while moving the legs, that you should move the hip skirts out of the way before moving the legs, or you might damage them a little bit. But now moving on to the knees, it can get about a 90-degree bend. And something I didn't mention in the sculpt is that there is some sculpt work when you actually bend the knee, which is a nice little touch they added. Finally, moving down the feet, they can't tilt up or down, but they can tilt to the side. So the posability on this guy is pretty good, but the problem is that some of the tolerances on the joints aren't the greatest, so it does make it difficult to get him into some poses sometimes. Especially with that leg being loose, it is very difficult to get him into a wide stance without him completely toppling over. So I'm definitely going to have to add some super glue or something into that joint to make it a little bit more stiff. But if you get a copy that has some tight joints, or you tighten the joints yourself, I think this guy's posability is great. Now that we're done talking about posability, let's move on to the transformation for this guy. So to start off, I'm going to definitely need a bigger spot for transformations and reviews because this guy does not fit in any of my spots. But getting back to the transformation, it's pretty fun and easy, but there are some problem spots. For starter, the major one is going to be for the tank mode. For starters, on my copy, it was pretty difficult to pull the front part of the tank out. Maybe I was just transforming it wrong, but it was really difficult to get it out the first time, but now it's slowly been getting easier. The second thing I want to mention is the head. So the face is supposed to be able to rotate around for tank mode, but I do have a problem with it. So this little lever is supposed to rotate the face around, but mine has a lot of difficulty doing so. I've only transformed this thing a few times, but I've almost already broken off the lever on this guy. So I highly recommend, if you're going to try to rotate the face around, to remove the visor and just move the face with your finger. Because a lot of the reviews I've seen have said a very similar thing, so I'm thinking that it's a mold issue. So once again, don't rotate the face using the lever, just push it with your finger. But other than that, there was a couple other minor issues, such as the little side cannons on his tank not coming out very easily. But I'm sure I can fix that if I just add a little bit of grease or something. But then he comes out to a nice looking base mode. So talking about his base mode, I think it does look pretty solid. I think it's a little small for your legend scale figures, but that's kind of the problem with Omega Supreme. Either his robot mode is going to be way too big or his base mode is going to be way too small. You have to pretty much pick. But I'd personally rather have a properly sized robot mode than a properly sized base mode. And for those who do want a more properly scaled base mode, just get the Siege or any of the Masterpiece versions of Omega Supreme. I will mention there's no sort of rails on the track to keep the tank on there, which kind of sucks, but it's not a big deal. And fun fact, if you take the tank from the Pangu Toys Omega Supreme and put it on the tracks for the Siege one, it fits perfectly. So for those who want a more proper sized tank for their Siege Omega Supreme, there you go, you have another reason to get this figure. I will admit the rocket's a little stubby, but that's because it doesn't extend at all when it transforms. There are some things that could be a little better, and I guess the base mode could be a little bigger, but once again, what are you going to do about the size? And if you want a little alt mode in front of your Masterpiece version of your Omega Supreme, that would also work pretty well. So for the overall base mode, besides the rocket maybe being a tiny bit bigger, I have no complaints. So now let's move on to my final thoughts for this figure and whether or not you should buy him. Starting with the negatives, I'd say the biggest one is going to be some of the tolerances on this guy. So the main problem that I see is that he doesn't have any sort of ratchet joints, and that's going to make a lot of his joints become loose over time. In fact, I'm already going to have to tighten up some of my joints, and I've only had it for a couple weeks now. Then the other major flaw I see is some of the sculpt work on this guy. I'm assuming it's because Pangu Toys is a newer company that hasn't made figures like this before, but a lot of the sculpt work is pretty sloppy. Now when I say sculpt, I'm not talking about the fine details sculpted in there. I really do like that on the figure. I'm talking about the parts where there's gaps where there shouldn't be any. And the main example of this is where there's a lot of gaps where there shouldn't be, such as in the face and the back. But there's a lot of things that show that this is a newer company that needs to improve on some things. Then my only other complaint is going to be that the wings are a tiny bit too long. I wish they folded in a little bit more, but that's not really a big deal. But moving on to some of the positives, there are a lot. For starters, I think the overall sculpt is fantastic. A lot of people have just said it's a legend scale DX9 Gabriel, and I definitely agree on that. It's definitely not one-to-one, but it's still fantastic looking Omega Supreme. Then I also really like the accessories he comes with. Unlike many figures that come with a crazy amount of accessories that half the time I personally don't even use, this guy actually comes with accessories that I will frequently use, such as the blast effects and his little repair bot. In fact, that little repair bot is a nice little addition to my collection as well. And then my final positive for this guy is going to be his price point. This is definitely going to be one of the most affordable Omega Supremes you can get, and he's really a good looking Omega Supreme. He's definitely one of the most affordable Omega Supremes out there, and he definitely isn't bad for that price. Considering that there are many other legend scale figures that are more expensive that are way smaller, I think this guy is a fantastic deal. Especially if you don't want to pay double the price for the new age version that's coming out. In fact, I like this Omega Supreme so much that I'm going to keep him as my regular desk spot. He has a fantastic sculpt, great paint applied to him, and he is pretty posable for an Omega Supreme. Like I said, if you're able to tighten up the joints on him, I think that'll really help, but overall, he's a fantastic figure. So when it comes to my recommendation for Pangu Toys Omega Supreme, I highly recommend it. He's a really great looking Omega Supreme, and he fits in fantastic to my legend scale collection. And like I said, at that price, he really is an amazing figure. So that's going to be my review on Pangu Toys Omega Supreme. Let me know what you guys think down below. Let me know if you already have him or if you plan on picking him up. But once again, if you enjoyed this review, make sure to like and subscribe. It really does help me out. Finally, once again, one like equals one pat for my little buddy Doug. Finally, once again, if you enjoyed any of the music in this video or just want to support the channel in general, it's all part of my royalty-free music label, Speakerhead Studios, link in description. But that's going to be it for me, guys. I appreciate you checking out the video, and I'll catch all y'all in the next one. Peace.